Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University.
Welcome to the Politics Guys, the podcast where we look at the deeper side of politics. I'm Trey Orndorff, and this week I'm joined by Michael Baranowski, who has an exciting new project. And in fact, it's so exciting, I really wish I would have come up with it myself. Michael, tell us a little bit about this new project.
Well, thanks, Trey. It's certainly new. At least it's exciting to me. I hope it's exciting to listeners. I am going to start a blog on the site where on every week I post what the latest on my research, what I'm doing, and maybe some random things here and there that I'm thinking. And the reason why I'm starting this has to do sort of with, number one, the fact that I'm on sabbatical, and number two, how academic publishing works. Now, Trey, I know you're really familiar with how academic publishing works. Basically, if you are an academic and you publish a book, unless you're some really huge name, you're kind of guaranteed a very small audience. And if you're someone like me,
How small, Michael? No.
well, my first book that I published on my first sabbatical, Navigating the News, I was, really proud of it. I think it's a good book. But it only had, last sales figures I looked at, around 500 and something copies sold. Now, for an academic book, that's not horrible. But I really wanted to get this message out about political media to a lot more people. And going the academic route, I'm not able to do that. And so I'm on a sabbatical right now to work on a project about the politics of food. And there's a surprising amount of politics involved in food. I've been researching how avocados, of all things. I'm a big avocado fan. And there's a ton of politics about how avocados are tied into NAFTA and organic politics and just all kinds of stuff that's really fascinating. I want to share this with people because I think people will be really interested in it. But if I go strictly the academic route, that's not going to happen. So what I'm going to do is, as I work on this book, I'm going to put out weekly sort of updates about what I'm researching and what I found and so forth. And it'll give me a chance to get feedback, to interact with people, so I can sort of change and improve what I'm doing as I go on. Kind of like crowdsourcing the editing, if you will. I hope there'll be kind of a vibrant comment section. And like I said, I'm really excited about this, and we'll see how it goes. So by the time that this episode is up, the first post will be up there, and you can find it at politicsguys.com/Mike. So let me check it out. Let me know what you think. I'm really excited about this experiment, and I'm looking forward to getting everyone's feedback.
I'm really kind of excited to read it myself. Food politics is a fascinating topic. I mean, it's something that I know that is near and dear to your heart and your family's heart, for that matter. So
yeah, absolutely. My wife published a book on food politics a few years back, and we're both very interested in it. And I hope it's going to be something that a lot of people will really find something useful and fascinating from. So we will see.
So we'll have to see what happens as you pull the veil from the weekly ramblings of academic research, which is messy, people. I just want you all to know this. It's exciting, but it's messy.
Yeah, definitely. So again, that's politicsguys.com/Mike, and let me know what you think.
Wonderful. Now, for the podcast this week, we're going to be taking a look. We've had just a fascinating week for those of us who are interested in policymaking. So we're going to be getting down in the dirty nitty-gritty of the House's GOP tax proposal. Trump just nominated a new Fed chair. We've got some really interesting indictments of some people surrounding Team Trump and including Team Trump. And of course, we have the incredibly sad events happening in New York City on Halloween. And so what we want to begin with this week is we want to move to the GOP tax plan. And one of the primary goals that I think our listeners are going to be recognized for the Politics Guys is we're always trying to look at long-term policy issues. And that means this week we're going to get wonky right here. Okay, we're going to get wonky, and we're going to be taking a look at the complicated questions surrounding the GOP's tax proposal. And for the record, that is actually officially called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which, I mean, names are so phenomenal when they come out of Congress. We can talk about that later. In broad strokes, here's what's going to happen. The plan kills many, if not most, deductions, while it overall simplifies and lowers most of the income tax brackets. So things like the electric vehicle deduction, state income tax, and a host of other deductions are getting tossed out. Um, how does this kind of break down? The current income tax system has 7 brackets that range from 10% to 39.6%. The GOP tax bill would actually collapse that to 4 with rates of 12, 25, 35, and 39.6 respectively. And the consensus from most of the analysts that I took a look at is that most people would see a small income tax reduction, although really the extent to which that's going to happen depends on a lot of factors, like whether or not you itemize. There's a number of other big changes that I know that Mike and I are going to get into, including the standard deduction is going to be going up by nearly double for both individuals to $12,000, $24,000 for couples. There was a lot of worry before this came out that earlier versions of this bill were going to change contributions to 401k. That's going to actually end up staying put. The other big change is going to be there's going to be a cap for mortgage deductions for future home buyers, but only those that exceed $500,000. The other big news here is the corporate income tax is going to get cut from 35 to 20%, which is not quite what Trump had asked for, but it's a big change and a big win for Team Trump. Let me just get started, Michael. I'm going to say that all in all, there's some problems, but all in all, I think this is a positive to me. My really big poison pill here is the fact, and this is multiple outlets, but even our libertarian wing friends are worried about the national debt increase here because we're talking about somewhere in the realm of 1.5 trillion. I'd love if we could somehow, I know Republicans think that we're going to be able to offset that. I think that's a debatable point. But before we talk more about that, Mike, just what do you think about in general? And what are the things you've liked and you've disliked?
Well, maybe I'll surprise some people in that I don't hate everything in this plan. I know on the left, this is kind of I've read some of the stuff from Vox, kind of hyperventilating over this, and some other outlets on the left. There are some things here that I think are really good, and in taking a look at the plan, I came up with sort of 4 things I kind of mostly like, and 4 things I definitely don't like. So the definitely don't likes kind of overwhelmed the likes, but I thought if it would be okay, I could start with the things that actually I think are good and positive things in this plan. For instance, the cap on mortgage deduction. I think that's long, that's something we should have done a while ago. I think it's a really smart move. Both economists on the left and the right think that that's a smart move. Now, the realtors and the home builders don't like it, but I think that's a really good idea.
As a matter of fact, it sounds kind of democratic in some ways to me, given that you're capping that at 500,000.
Yeah, and only like 5%, I believe, of all of all mortgages are for more than $500,000. So this is actually something that is kind of progressive in that sense. Is it's not going to affect most Americans. It's only going to affect that 5%. So that's actually for liberals should see this as kind of a progressive type of thing. A second, well, also on that, I should say that I like the idea that it's a pro mobility tax change in that one of the problems I think is that we have in this country is that once you have a house, that's a great thing, of course, but it kind of ties you down to that, and so that actually can have a negative effect on economic mobility, people moving places to geographic mobility, to get jobs and so forth. And some economists have asked, well, should we actually tie people down like this in these big houses that they can't necessarily afford? And I think you can make an argument that maybe we shouldn't. So there's that. Secondly, I really like the idea of boosting the standard deduction. A lot has been made of tax simplification. I think that's really important. Now, I actually itemize my taxes, and in my kind of income. Well, most people don't, though, right? I mean, most richer people do. I certainly don't fall into that richer people category.
Well, you led off the show by announcing that you were an academic, so I think that we're clear on that.
Oh, Exactly. But most people, something like I want to say 70% or something like that is the number I saw, people don't itemize. And so those people are actually going to be helped by boosting this standard deduction. And again, who's going to be hurt by this? I think generally speaking, it's a progressive type of change, and it makes the tax code on the individual side simpler for most Americans. I really like that. Okay. So that's the second thing I really like. A third thing I really like is that it increases the child tax credit. Again, that's something I think that economists on both the left and the right like. I would have liked to have seen more of an increase, but hey, I'll take, I think it's from 1,000 to 1,600. That's a move in the right direction. And then finally, I really like that the corporate tax rate was lowered. And again, this is something where economists on both the left and the right have a strong amount of agreement. Even if you take a look at what's called the effective corporate tax rate, which is not 30 something percent, it's in the 20s somewhere. The US still has one of the highest, I think the top 5 corporate tax rates in all of the OECD. That's the rich industrialized countries. And I think there's a good case to be made that that needs to come down, and that you need to lower that rate and take out some of those loopholes. And that's what this plan does, I think, or at least tries to do. And so I'm all for that. So those are all of the things that I really like, or at least mostly like, about this
And
plan.
and I agree with you on that last one, Michael. And I think it's important to note that I think that the Republicans have the best argument to say that there's going to be some revenue generation from that one, because it is incredible the amount of money that is parked overseas purposefully to avoid that tax rate. And there's nothing you can do in the tax code to change that other than try to get it back in the U.S. at a slightly lower let rate.
Yeah, and actually that move to a territorial tax system, and that move of allowing companies to repatriate that money at a special one-time sort of low rate. I believe it's 12%. I mean, those things make a lot of sense to me. And actually, those things, especially the territorial system, that kind of puts us more in line with what the rest of the world does, and I think for very good reason. So there's a lot, I think, to actually like about this plan, at least to partially like, I would say. Now, that being said, of course, there are a lot of things I don't really like. Before we get into that, though, I was thinking we could take a moment to thank our first sponsor for today. Actually, our sponsor for today, and that's Blue Apron. Blue Apron, of course, is the #1 fresh ingredient and recipe delivery service in the United States, and their mission is to make incredible home cooking accessible to everyone. That's even people like me. I never thought I could actually cook, but with Blue Apron, I can, you can, and make great meals. And they do it all with these super fresh, high quality ingredients. I just got my latest delivery just yesterday, and the produce is amazing. They partner with over 150 local farms, fisheries, and ranchers across the U.S., and they source ingredients to support a sustainable food system. And the thing I really love is you get everything you need, including all the seasonings and these clear, full color sheets to give you everything you need to know to prepare these meals, even if you're an idiot in the kitchen like I am. And plus, it's incredibly flexible. I get to choose from a variety of meals. And if there's a week where I think, yeah, I don't think so, or I'm on vacation or something, I can skip those weeks. And just listen to the mouthwater meals on wheels that they're currently featuring. Seared chicken and roasted fall vegetables with caper butter pan sauce, shrimp and pesto fettuccine with spinach, and black bean and cheese tortas with roasted broccoli and lime sour cream. Just great stuff. And plus, it's a great value too. Less than $10 per person per meal, delivered right to your door. If you check out this week's menu, you'll get $30 off your first order with free shipping by going to blueapron.com/TPG. You'll love how good it feels and tastes to create incredible home cooked meals with Blue Apron. So don't wait. That's blueapron.com/TPG. Blue Apron, a better way to cook. Okay, so Trey, like I said, I don't want my friends on the left to think that I'm
So we've
all of a sudden.
converted you basically, like that it's all over, it's done. My-
I am not anything like that, right?
So what do you hate? What do you hate? Because this is make them happy, and then we can argue.
Okay, the 4 things I don't like. I don't at all like doing away with the AMT, the alternative minimum tax, which was put in place to make sure that rich people actually pay some taxes and that their clever tax attorneys can't get them out of all of their taxes. I hate that. Okay. Second thing I hate lowering tax rates on the top 1%. I mean, I think you make a case of, well, maybe we don't raise them, but there's no need to lower them, especially getting, which I'll get to the thing I hate the most. And the third thing I really hate is doing this through the reconciliation process. I've talked about this in previous episodes. This is no way to pass major legislation. It creates all kinds of weird, perverse incentives. And if you take a look at the nitty gritty details of this plan, there are weird things that kind of pop in and pop out. And the reason why you get this kind of crazy quilt of things that doesn't make any sense from a policy sense is because the reconciliation rules say that it can't add to the deficit, add to the debt after 10 years, and you have to abide by the reconciliation instructions, and it's just crazy. And then finally, the thing I hate the most, and I think you'll agree with me on this, Trey, is that it adds $1.5 trillion to the debt
Yeah.
over this 10-year period. And think about this, okay? Our current debt is 20.4 trillion last I checked on the incredibly rapidly escalating debt clock. So this tax reform all by itself is going to increase that by 7.3% over the next decade. And that's without taking into account, budget busting things like national disasters, terrorist attacks, wars, and so on, things you just can't account for. So that to me sounds insane. And here's the thing: if you kept the AMT, if you kept the estate tax, and if you didn't lower individual rates for the top 1%, you could do all of those great things I think that the plan does and keep it pretty much revenue neutral. Now, that's a plan that I think you could get some bipartisan support for, but that's not the plan that we have. And that's why, in the end, I find this plan hugely, hugely disappointing.
So it sounds like on the whole, though you've got some positives about it, that you're kind of negative on the plan as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, more than anything else, it's that Republicans have, at least many in the party have, in my view, abrogated their responsibility as deficit hawks, as watchdogs of this sort of thing. This is, if you take a look at the longer term projections as to how much of our we're paying to just pay off interest on the debt and how that's going to increase over time, you start to see some pretty scary numbers. When you go into the 2030s, 2040s, someone's going to have to pay that price. And so when Republicans say this doesn't raise taxes, the biggest tax increase is on the future, and we're pushing this $1.5 trillion tax increase plus the interest on that, which even at say 2% is another 30 billion. We're pushing that on future generations of Americans. So to say this isn't an enormous tax increase is simply not true. It's just a tax increase on the future. And this sort of short-sighted, kicking the can down the road sort of politics is something I have huge problems with, and something that Republicans used to have huge problems with too.
Well, I think you're right. I do definitely agree. As I noted at the beginning, this 1.5 trillion is the black eye of the plan. This is the fatal, potentially poison pill. But from my point of view, I'm definitely tired that Republicans have copped out on this. But what has happened, pragmatically speaking, is that Democrats won't move on how much we're spending, and Republicans aren't going to move on changing tax program. And so as a result, what they can always end up finding consensus on is, hey, I'll let you lower how much we're bringing in as long as you let me keep all my programs. And,
Yep.
and so, I agree, but I guess I see a little bit more bipartisan blame to go around in this one. And this is probably my libertarian wing coming out to say, look, this is one of the problems with having these two major modern ideologies in place is that we end up doing what I think is a lot of good, but then we end up killing that good, as you know, by lowering taxes, by raising taxes in the future, and that's problematic.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there's blame to go around on both sides here, and that many Democrats aren't willing enough to consider some cuts in spending, or at least removing certain deductions. But there are certain things I think that maybe we can have some agreement on, like for instance the mortgage interest deduction. That's a huge chunk in and of itself, and maybe if you take something like that and you decide, well, let's not try to massively overhaul things. Let's work incrementally at the edges and find a few deductions that maybe you can get 60 votes for in the Senate, and kind of work on, some sort of revenue neutral plans for kind of chipping away at this. Now, that's not exciting and that's not something you necessarily trumpet, but it's at least a move in the right direction, and maybe it helps to build some sort of a basis of trust. And that sounds to me like I'm just being sort of really Pollyannish and so forth. But
Well,
that's that.
I don't think it's Pollyannish, Michael, but I think the problem is that at this juncture, and this is not just true of Republicans, but when you have policy measures that are small, they are not going to generate the media attention necessary to count
Yeah,
as a win. There is a
yep,
difference between making a policy change that is positive and getting a win racked up in voters' minds. And to get a win racked up in voters' minds, you've got to do something big. I mean, again, go back to the Obama era when Democrats are trying to make big healthcare changes. Yeah, they could have made a host of little things that could have made things better, but none of them would have gotten the win of having, now the named Obamacare, if you will, air quotes around that, go into place.
yeah,
And Trump is even in a worse position here because during his tenure such far, and I disagree with the idea that presidents need to try to get things done rapidly. But if they don't, the reason they're tied up in this is we have this idea that to be successful, you've got to get things done in the first X number of days, in the first X number of months. And he hasn't had any big motion. So if he comes out and if Republicans come out and say, hey, look, here's these 5 really important things we want to do, but none of them are going to nab any time on ABC, NBC, CNN, right down the list, it's a loss.
yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I entirely agree. It's become this sort of zero sum game, and all about wins for my team, and vanquishing the other team, and that, I think, in the end, as we've seen, I think is horribly destructive to the what should be the real focus, is that what's going to make the American people healthier, happier, safer, better off, and that, I think, gets lost in the shuffle far too often.
It does, and a lot of times we blame politicians for these things, but as kind of a last note on this, maybe I would also like to say that a lot of the blame lies on citizenry who is just simply not willing to spend an iota of time on these kinds of issues. And I know our listeners are a little different because, right, I mean, you're not listening to the politics guys unless you have at least a baseline level of interest in talking about politics. But, the fact that, uh, in my classes, students will often decry the things that Congress does. And I'll say, well, look, if I could create an app for you that told you everything perfectly unbiased. I mean, again, we recognize this is probably an impossibility, but if I could do it, produce this app that tells you everything that's happening in Congress, how much would you pay for it? And the answer is in most cases, they wouldn't even download it if it was free.
Yeah. Okay.
So, we do these polls, and and again, it's probably an oversample since you're in a politics class, you're going to probably want to answer the other way. And yet, even in this area where we know we're going to oversample, people are like, would I really want to look at that? No. Well, this is what you get. I mean, that seems kind of harsh, but I mean that.
I agree, and I'm sad that we're closing in this story, at least in such a negative note. But that gets into a whole line of sort of what I call democracy is doomed thinking and theorizing and so forth, and you can kind of sort of see that argument play out. I mean, I certainly hope those folks who argue that are wrong, but geez, it's just so depressing, Trey. I gotta say.
Well, I guess the upside is just as Winston Churchill once said, right? It's the worst form of government, but it's better. Well, it's not that's exactly what he's saying, but he's going to say it's the worst form of government except other ones that have been tried. And I guess there is truth in that. When you look at these things, you say that they're off and they're horrible. But it's better than it could be. But it doesn't stop us from at least being realistic about what happens. And so when you want to analyze something like this, you have to be willing. It is always easy to say it's all Congress's fault. And I guess the point has to be here is Congress is what we make it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, I mean, not to stay on things that are potentially depressive, Mike, but the other big news this week is Robert Mueller gave us, as Steve Van Dyke from University of Texas said, an appetizer, a tantalizing first step against Trump aides Manafort and Gates. The allegations are tax evasion, money laundering, lobbying done secretively, false statements, making misleading statements, and a failure to report foreign bank and financial accounts. Meanwhile, we have a plea deal coming out. I can't speak for making false statements that includes key details about the Russian alleged attempts to reach the Trump campaign. So the truth of the matter is, this has been a big week. The indictments are a big deal. But while we can talk about it for a minute, I just want listeners to recognize this is not the end of the process. This is the beginning of the process. So while Team Trump has definitely this week suggests that this is all clearing the White House, most analysts and myself agree that if anything, it really shows that Mueller is looking at a wide-ranging set of charges and is shooting up, I think, a little higher on the food chain than most people thought he might start. Um, so I don't think that collusion, despite Trump's Twitter feed, is the big issue here. Rather, it's going to be the focus on those more normal crimes that have clearly been surrounding the White House as it's related to activities with foreign agents. And to be real honest, I have teased on a number of occasions that I would love to have been a speechwriter for Trump. And Michael, in all honesty, that would be a phenomenal job in some ways. But right
Yeah.
now, this is where even doing it for fun, tongue in cheek, if you really could have gotten yourself in, this is when you would want to make sure that your bank accounts are in order, because if the only people not sweating in the White House right now are the ones who are too dumb to recognize what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, this is sort of what happens when you're an outsider candidate who has to hire other outsiders for your campaign, folks who don't have much at all inside the Beltway experience, at least not recent inside the Beltway experience. I mean, Manafort had been out of the game for a long time. And so you get people like Papadopoulos or Manafort or Trump Jr. or Kushner or Flynn, these people who don't know the rules, both the written and the unwritten rules, and they end up doing really dumb things like talking to people, who say they have information from the Russian government that might help to, hurt Hillary Clinton and that sort of thing. And I don't think, and a lot of people will disagree with me on this, I don't think this goes all the way up to the president. I think that probably it may go as high as Kushner, as Trump Jr. and so forth. And I think these people are guilty mainly of doing really, really stupid things. And that's bad enough, certainly. But I also think that, there was a lot of joy on the left when these indictments came out. I mean, that's sort of what I saw on social media, the dancing and cheering and all that. I think I think people on my side of things need to check their expectations. Here's what I'm thinking. And I mentioned this on Facebook this week. How does this play out? Let's say Manafort or anyone else who's indicted does have something that can directly implicate President Trump. Now, I don't even think that's the case. I would be really surprised if there's something that can directly implicate the president. But even saying that's the case, the president, right, pardons them, calls it a heroic gesture to save them from the greatest political witch hunt in world history, which is what he's already called it. So what happens there? Well, the mainstream media totally freaks out. Trump's base loves it, and he's not a whole heck of a lot worse off than he is now at like 37% approval, right? I mean, come on, he's pretty much hit bottom in terms of that. What's the worst case scenario here? To me, the worst case scenario, or if you're a liberal, the best case scenario is the Democrats take over the House in 2018. January 2019, we see impeachment hearings start. He ends up getting impeached, but the Senate doesn't convict because you need two-thirds to convict. And so once again, President Trump declares victory, calls it the greatest political witch hunt in world history. The mainstream media freaks out. Trump's base loves it. And we're right back where we started. I mean, that to me is how I see this playing out. Now, maybe that's wrong, but again, I think there are some bad stuff that happened, certainly, at least potentially. But I think people who expect this to lead to the removal of the president, I think that's more kind of the triumph of hope over what might realistically happen. And so, hey, I want to see President Trump gone too. Believe me, my fellow liberals, I will cheer when he is no longer president of the United States. But if you're pinning your hopes on this, I just think you might be setting yourself up for disappointment.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and again, if you take a look at the legal scholars, analyst of this, he is looking at your run of the mill. I mean, again, when I say run of the mill, I don't mean to downplay the illegality of what's going on. I just mean you're right. I think most people on the left are thinking to themselves, this is collusion, this is treason, and it's not. I mean, that's at least not what is happening right now, and probably not what's going to happen in the future. And your little hypothetical, we can actually go back in time and take a look at another president in the reverse situation. I'm thinking about Clinton,
Yep.
the William Jefferson variety, and Republicans wanted him gone so badly. So again, let's put aside, because I recognize already that the left is going to say, look, the difference though is that's wrong. Okay, from your point of view, true, fine, whatever. The process though is going to be the same. He continues to be there. He has an amazing legacy. So, there is no guarantee that going down that road means that you're going to out Trump, or that you're going to stop him from winning a reelection, or that you're going to stop him from doing things that the Republican base doesn't love.
Yeah, and actually, the impeachment process is generally seen, at least in Clinton's case, as something that ended up hurting the Republicans, and energizing Democrats. And that's certainly, if you're a liberal, that's certainly not a result you want to see. And so, I think you need to be aware of the fact that there's the potential that this could actually have the reverse effect of what we really want. And that to me is a very real concern.
No, I agree. But I mean, again, now the thing, if you want to be a little more, again, get into the details, we're talking about this with the tax plan. The upside is it is showing that we aren't having people who are just kind of helter-skelter getting away with things, even if it's a dumbness. And I think that's a positive with the system. And we have a special investigator who's weathering I think some unwarranted criticism, still bringing charges, still investigating, not starting low on the food. I mean, those are all positive things for a democratic system. But I think that the point that you're making, Michael, is right. You don't want to think of this as being like the big Russia goodbye Trump win. They're different things. And just because that doesn't happen doesn't mean that what's happening here is a bad thing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So, because we just like, sad news here on the show this week, but actually this is what's going on. We're going to turn to a much, much sadder note when we again have to turn to kind of a tragic event, the truck attack in New York City. On Tuesday, the suspect, and Michael, I'm actually going to need help with this. I have been practicing this all week, and I'm still not saying his name properly. Can you say his name?
Oh gosh, no, I'm horrible with names too. But I think listeners know that who we're talking about, obviously.
I believe it's Sipov, I think is the way that you say that. I have tried that a bunch.
That
Listeners,
sounds good to me.
If I got that wrong, this is my apology to you in advance. Okay.
Right.
Anyway, he's 29. He rented a Home Depot truck, and he runs people over on Halloween. He's from Uzbekistan, and just a little side note, because I know that when you kind of list these names, sometimes people's reaction is, this is weird, it's a long way away. As a matter of fact, I have a good colleague who I went to graduate school with, who started and has continued her career in Uzbekistan because she studies Russia. So I actually have some friends there. Just a heads up that, just because you're Uzbek doesn't mean anything. Anyway, his charges, interestingly enough, because of his use of the vehicle, it will allow for the potentiality of the death penalty, despite the fact that it's in New York. Um, Even sadder, Michael, and this is just blew me away. He's married with 3 children. I mean, I can't even imagine. Um,
No.
he's allegedly radicalized via a bunch of ISIS videos that have been uncovered, including videos he was watching for making explosive devices and killing prisoners. A little more incriminatingly, it appears that what he did in New York was actually he carefully followed the instructions that he had from an ISIS magazine for a vehicle attack, and the choice of a target as a bike path, which is what he uses. As a matter of fact, is a part of that layout in the ISIS's magazine. And I just want everybody to know that here at the Politics Guys, we try to recognize, the true human value of the issues, and truly our prayers and thoughts are with the victims in New York City. Uh, but I do want to note something to listeners to think about, because it's really easy, because I know we just had Las Vegas, and as a nature of the show, we're always going to be dealing with the kind of salient events that happen in a particular week or month. But I want you to recognize as listeners that there is a danger in us doing this, and it's a danger that we recognize, and that is to being careful about being agenda set or primed. Agenda setting is where listeners or watchers or viewers, they prioritize issues based on the number of times they hear about an issue in the media. And then if you've been primed, it's when you kind of take that one step further, in a sense, and you start making choices based on those issues that are relevant in the media. And so recently we've had a lot of this, and I think it's really easy to become scared and terrorized, which is precisely what a terrorist organization wants, right? ISIS's goal as an organization is fear. And so I do want to contextualize something about base rates for you. And that is, as you take a look at the CDC website, that if you really want to be worried about something, even if you live in a large city like New York, that statistically speaking, heart disease, cancer, obesity, suicide even, are far, 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 far more likely to kill
Hmm.
you. And so we're
Absolutely.
going to be talking about this because it's important, but I don't want our listeners to walk away, since we've had so many of these, thinking I need to be living my life in fear. No, if you want to fear something, fear not exercising enough, fear not eating enough veggies. Don't fear ISIS in that sense, because we're going to talk about them, but I don't want to give them the credit that they somehow should be holding fear over your life. So I just wanted to kind of start that off with that, Michael, and then kind of turn it to you and what you think about what's going on.
I think it's an excellent point. I guess what aside from certainly agreeing with all that you say, I think it's very important and something we don't emphasize enough. I guess there are a couple of things that come to mind. Number one is, to me, this seems like, regrettably, uh, partly the price we pay for living in a free and open society. I mean, somebody on one of our listeners jokingly said, "Well, what are we going to do? Call for a ban on rental trucks?" I mean, and that when you have a free flow of information, when you're committed to the ideals of a free society, this sort of hate spews out, and there's a small number of people who buy into hateful ideologies, who get sucked into them for various reasons, and are able to use the very openness of our society to do these sort of things. And as you point out, it's very difficult to do, and it overall, in terms of the impact, it's far, far less than other things like auto accidents, or even things like, I'm sure, like slipping in the tub and dying, that kind of thing. But but it's difficult to just do away with this kind of thing. I mean, it's again kind of the price we pay. And that, to me, is why I was sort of not surprised but disappointed when the President Trump suggested, well, this is clearly a problem with the diversity lottery system, which we need to get rid of, which he called a Chuck Schumer beauty, as he put it on. You know, and just to give listeners a sense of this, now this diversity program was created in 1990, and yes, Chuck Schumer supported it, as did 88 other people in the Senate. It passed the Senate by 89-8. vote, and the House 264 to 118. So the idea of making this kind of a partisan issue, that I think is more than a stretch. It's just simply not true. And then the president goes on to say our criminal justice system is a joke and a laughing stock,
That
which
was
again,
that was horrible. Continue.
empirically not true. And in fact, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who, I'm no great fan of, certainly came out, a few days later, basically to say, no, actually, it's not a joke and a laughing stock. And again, this is, it's, at this point, obviously, it's not surprising to me. I actually sort of get, I can kind of understand the president, because sometimes people will post stuff on Facebook, or I'll read about stuff and I'll have this initial impulse to post something on the Politics Guys feed. And I've learned more often than not, generally speaking, to just wait a few minutes and think about that post. And I've actually deleted a few things right away, or just, I'm going to come back to this. Clearly, the president of the United States doesn't do that, right? He hears something, he sees something, and he gets upset like all of us do, and then he just posts something, and that's maybe not a big deal if you're the host of the Politics Guys, or you're just, Joe Citizen or Jane Citizen. But if you're the president of the United States, words and tweets have implications, have a big effect. And if you're concerned about the legitimacy of our institutions and the effectiveness of our institutions and how people see that, geez, you can't be doing stuff like that. And the president of the United States, one would expect, is somebody who should know that. And yet, clearly, this president doesn't.
No, and one more thing on that is, especially when he's talking about the justice system, the kinds of things you have to do to get rid. So, I mean, if you want to get rid of freedom in order to minimize these kinds of attacks, and again, I recognize that I have my own bias, but you can take a look at the Federalist Papers if you disagree with me. You're going to be getting rid of the very thing that you want. So you want to take a look at where people are dying indiscriminately at higher rates. Take a look at repressive regimes, and then make a statistical evaluation of whether you'd rather live with the very, very unlikely possibility of a terrorist attack in a world that values freedom, or live in a place where we don't value freedom, and yet what you actually end up getting is not the thing that you're hoping for, security, but rather insecurity.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's just dead right. So, there's that great quote. Was it from Benjamin Franklin, right? Those who give up liberty for security deserve neither, or something along those lines. And I think it really can become a slippery slope. We need to be careful about tightening up and losing these sort of really important values that are what make us, I think, special and important in the United States. The things that we all are supposed to hold up as what it means to be an American, and we need to be real careful about that, I think. And diversity, certainly, bringing people in from various places, around the world. That's part of what makes America great. And I think just indiscriminate calls to do away with that that to me is a dangerous thing.
It is, and one last note: I was reading a book about Americans in Paris, and one of the things this is taking place about a couple hundred years ago. This one of the things that's fascinating about it is that one of the big issues for Americans were how shocked they were that you need papers to go into France, because from their point of view, that was dictatorial and authoritarian, right? People should be able to come to the United States and just come in. And then they go to France, and there's this whole system. You need all these papers, and it's amazing how many of them journaled about, oh my goodness, I'm so happy I live in a country that values making it easy to come into the country, and they recognize that as they try to go into a different country. And I know that we've had a shift on that thinking over the past 100 years or so, but I think it's a shift that we ought to be very cognizant of and consider carefully.
Well, and I think that goes to your, I know we need to move on pretty quickly, but I just wanted to say, I know that goes to your, I think, initial point about this. And certainly these attacks are horrible and awful, and we should do everything within reason to try to make them harder for people to carry out. But just like we talked about gun violence, domestic gun violence after the the horrible Las Vegas thing, and some people have suggested, and I think reasonably so, that well, it seems like millions of Americans have said, our right to bear arms, this freedom is something that's important enough that we don't want to restrict it, even if that means occasionally some people horribly, awfully abuse this freedom, and Americans die because of that. And this to me is that same sort of logic. And it may seem cold, but we need to weigh, what exactly are these freedoms worth? And different people will come to different conclusions. But to me, that these living in a free society is incredibly important. And so we need to be very careful about things we do to limit our freedom for the sake of potentially slightly more security at the margins. That to me is a slippery slope.
Agreed. Well, let's move on to our last story, Michael. We wanted to talk a little bit about Trump's nomination of Jerome, also known as Jay Powell, to the chair of the Federal Reserve on Thursday. So this just happened. The nomination is a break with the tradition of retaining the current Fed chair. Barack Obama kept Ben Bernanke, Clinton kept Greenspan, Ronald Reagan kept Volcker. But Trump goes a different direction. I don't think that's particularly surprising, but it is going to be interesting to take a look at Powell himself. Powell is deeply rooted in the GOP and in the financial industry. He is a lawyer and an investment banker by trade. And it seems likely, according to multiple news outlets, including the New York Times, that Trump passed over Yellen for a second term because of her favor in financial regulations. Because in many ways, interestingly, Powell is similar on everything except for these financial regulations. He has already won votes from Democrats when he was confirmed as a Fed governor in 2012 and again in 2014. So it seems really likely that this is going to go through. The other thing that's going to make Powell unique is he is the first to not really have a big economic background. He lacks a degree in economics. And really kind of the question mark that I'm seeing out there is the question about what kind of policy changes would come to financial regulations. And I know this is something that's near and dear to the heart of the left. So I know that's a big deal, despite it only being one thing that's supposed to make them different. So Michael, I'm really curious about what you think about this nomination.
Well, I'm not outraged. I'd like to think I'm not easily outraged. I mean, I'm not as concerned as some people are about the lack of academic economics background. I mean, he has experience on the board of governors. He's been there since 2012. He knows what's going on. He's pretty much a centrist. He's pretty much a pragmatist. One economist said he's kind of like the Republican version of Yellen, except not except very anti-regulation, and that seems to me to be reasonably accurate based on everything we know. And so, sure, I would have liked to have seen Yellen stay on because I'm a fan of much more financial regulation than the president would like. But this is a Republican president. This seems to me to be a pretty straightforward, centrist kind of Republican mainstream pick. And this would have been the kind of thing we could have expected under Donald Trump, under really any of the mainstream Republicans that were running who had a chance to win. So while I'm disappointed that Janet Yellen won't stay on, to me, it's like, well, yeah, okay.
Yeah. I mean, in all honesty, we could spend some time. We're kind of running out of time in the show. As a libertarian leaning kind of guy, I have issues with the Federal Reserve itself. But you're right. I mean,
So,
there it is. It's here. It's part of our system. So as far as nominees go, it's not something that I'm going to get up in arms about. But if we want to have a show about the Federal Reserve pro and con, we could always do that. And I probably have a slightly different position.
yeah, I would imagine.
Um, anything else on that topic, Michael?
Nope, that's pretty much it for me.
Well, then why don't we turn to what we're reading, and I'll let you go first. I've been leading everything off. What have you been reading this week?
Well, it's actually something that I've been listening to. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and one that I listen to all the time, or at least I check out all the time, are Ezra Klein's podcast. Now, listeners, you know that I have a tortured relationship with Ezra Klein. I know it's maybe unfair to call the relationship. I love some of the stuff he does, but I hate the fact that he seems to be so willfully blind and so dedicated to just being sucked into a liberal echo chamber where it seems like so many of Vox's and the Weeds stories start off, well, I don't understand why Republicans are so evil. Do you? And no, I don't understand either. I guess they're just bad, evil people. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not a lot if you look at some of their headlines. But here's the thing. When they actually bring conservatives into their discussions, I think that Ezra Klein and the Weeds and they do some of the best work that I see out there. Every once in a while that happens, and I whenever I see one of those things, I get excited, and it's almost always worth my time. And this week on his podcast, he interviews a fascinating guy, a conservative political scientist, a former Senate staffer, who basically argues that what the Senate actually needs is not less conflict, but more conflict. And it's a fascinating sort of, counterintuitive argument. I was one of the better hours of podcast listening that I've had in recent months. So I would strongly recommend it to people. And one other thing I wanted to point out is one thing I realized in listening to Ezra Klein talk to this guy, Wallner is his name, was that Ezra Klein doesn't seem to have much of an understanding, in my view, of the concept of loyalty. Now, that might sound weird, but at least maybe it doesn't count for much with him. And this made me think about the work of a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, who's done some fascinating stuff on what's called moral foundations theory, about how liberals and conservatives really speak in many cases a different language when it comes to basic orientations. And one of the ways in which he's found they're different, and this is like a cross-cultural thing, is that conservatives tend to put more value on loyalty and tradition and these things, and liberals don't. They put value on other things, but it leads to oftentimes conservatives and liberals kind of talking past each other because they don't appreciate the importance of these values to the other side. And so I recommend Jonathan Haidt's work to people as well. But for now, I'd say check out this podcast, this particular episode. I think you'll find it well worth your time.
That's fascinating. As for me, I think I I've decided that I'm probably the guy who consumes, or I'm always recommending at least the most books and video games. Uh, and this week is not going to be that different. I've got a book that I have just gotten done finished reading, and there's some parts in it that I have some issues with, but overall, I would still highly recommend. It's called The President's Club. Have you read that yet, Michael?
No, I've heard of it though, so I'm interested in getting your take on it.
Yeah, it's The President's Club. It's by Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy. So it's a non-scholarly take on the presidency, but really what they're focusing on is the relationship between presidents and the uniquely isolating circumstances when you are presidents that seeks you to reach out to former presidents, and how across aisles you end up reaching out to these other individuals because you feel so profoundly isolated. Now, right now, it just goes through Barack Obama, kind of as Barack Obama's beginning, from their point of view, beginning his terms in office. So I would be really fascinating to see if there's going to be a follow up, because you can't help but go through it. The whole time I was thinking about it, I just kept thinking as we got to the end about how George W. Bush at the nomination for Trump kept saying, like, that's some pretty weird, well, he used some
Uh-huh.
of the words going on here, and wondering, how the rest of the club, quote unquote, thought about this new member. And so it's really fascinating for that point of view. And I got some unique, I mean, I have read biographies on most every president in the United States in some detail. And I would say, even for me, I got some interesting insight about each of the men who have held the office from this unique point of view. And they had some really interesting interviews that were new with presidents that are still living. And so I really highly recommend it for that reason. I think that every now and then they try to make some broader claims that, as a political scientist, I'm uncomfortable with, but that is very minimal. And overall, I found it very enlightening.
Oh, it sounds great. All right, I'm looking for it. I think I'm gonna have to put that on my Amazon wish list, right?
Well, I was just fortunate. It hasn't been in the library forever and a day, and I was over at my weekly library visit, and there it was on the shelf, and I nabbed it. So you can't beat it.
Awesome. All right, well, I guess that does it for this kind of extended episode. We had a lot to talk about today,
Yeah, we did.
but thanks everyone for listening. We really hope what you like, you you like what you heard, I can talk too, and that you check out today's sponsor. That's Blue Apron. If you check out this week's menu, you get $30 off your first order with free shipping by going to blueapron.com/TPG. Also, I hope you'll check out my new blog where I'll be posting regular updates on my research and just random thoughts about, well, I don't know, whatever I happen to randomly be thinking about. And you can find that at politicsguys.com/Mike. Listener support is a huge help to us, and we really do appreciate it. And if you're interested in joining our great group of Politics Guys supporters, you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon link. And if you want to support the show without spending one thin dime, hey, you can do that too. That you can help us out by sharing this episode with your friends and followers, or passing along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Also, leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes really does help us out. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do that through email at mail@politicsguys.com, or our Facebook page where you can message us and we post stuff throughout the week. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Trey Orndorff. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.